Today at the shop we're working on a 2015 BMW 328i. We're going to be replacing the turbocharger. The first step is to disconnect the air hose. And we're going to release the clips across the front of the air intake housing. You want to disconnect the mass airflow sensor. And then you can go ahead and remove the whole air intake housing. You can pull up on that off of those rubber grommets and then pull the lower section out with the air filter. Then you can move on to disconnecting the turbo wastegate actuator. And then we need to remove the connecting rod between that actuator to the manifold. This is a bit tricky to do. There's a small cotter key that needs to be bent back and then pulled through. After that connecting rod is loose, then you can go ahead and remove the wastegate itself. Now we have the vehicle up in the air, and we're going to remove the splash shields from underneath the vehicle. There are quite a few screws holding these in place, so some sort of electric or air tool will speed up this process quite a bit. And also keep in mind there may be some of these bolts missing, or sometimes they also get kind of ground down from hitting parking stops, so they can be a little bit tricky to remove. Now we're going to remove the rear splash shield back by the transmission. And for the final piece, you need to rotate the shield past the final mounting bracket. Now with those shields out of the way, we can remove the metal skid plate. Now we're going to remove the charged air pipe from the turbo. This is a quick connect hose fitting with a spring release clamp. And then we can take off the vacuum hose clip. Now we need to move the engine cover out of the way. And remove the front inlet hose Then we'll disconnect the evap sensor, and there's also an additional vacuum hose to remove. And we'll disconnect the turbo sensor, and we'll remove the upper coolant hose from the engine. You want to have a drain pan in place or have already drained the coolant. Remove the other end of that hose at the radiator so the hose can be completely taken out of the way. And then we'll remove the turbo hose also from the radiator. Okay, now back under the vehicle, we're going to remove the bracket for the catalytic converter. That bolts onto the converter and then to the side of the transmission. You may have to gently tap that bracket to get it out of place. And then we'll remove the 2 bolts for the exhaust cross pipe bracket. Next, we'll remove the catalytic converter clamp bolt and separate it from the exhaust manifold. Now we can access the oil feed line for the turbocharger. It's back up behind the exhaust there. You want to pry that out. And then we can remove the 2 oil return bolts on the bottom of the turbocharger. It's a good idea to inspect these lines for leaks or for blockage. Next, we're going to remove the coolant lines to the turbo. Two Torx bolts that can be a little bit difficult to access. Now we're going to loosen the clamp for the air intake hose. And remove that nut that holds that pipe onto the turbo. Okay, next we want to remove the exhaust manifold nuts. It's best to work these in the reverse order of the tightening sequence, just to evenly release pressure on the manifold. May need a variety of swivel sockets or universal sockets to gain access to these bolts. Once those bolts are all out, we'll need to remove the electric water pump bolt. And then we can go ahead and remove the exhaust manifold and turbo assembly. carefully pull that up and out of there. You're going to want to install the new gaskets on the new manifold. Once those are in place, you can go ahead and get that new manifold down in there. Once the new manifold's in place, start each of the bolts by hand. Start snugging them down. You're going to want to follow the torque sequence. Make sure all the bolts are in place, the gaskets haven't slipped out. Okay, now you can reinstall the coolant feed and the return lines. It's best to replace the O-rings and gaskets on these lines. These are 2 Torx bolts that are going to get tightened to 8 foot-pounds. There's not much room to access here. Next will be the oil feed pipe. Again, inspect that feed line. If there's any blockage in it, it should be replaced. Install new O-rings on that. You want to install a new gasket for the return line, and then tighten those 2 Torx bolts also to 8 foot-pounds. You want to install a new gasket for the catalytic converter. Go ahead and work that back into place. And then you can get the exhaust back in place and install that cross pipe bracket. 2 Torx bolts to 12 foot-pounds. Now you need to access that band clamp and tighten the converter to the manifold. Next, we'll put the bracket back on that braces the converter to the side of the transmission. Here you'll have 2 bolts and 2 nuts. All of those will go to 12 foot-pounds. Next we'll reinstall that air tube, tighten the one bolt onto the front of the turbo. And reinstall the water pump bolts. And these get torqued to 18 foot-pounds. Can go ahead and install that air intake assembly. Work that down in place. And we'll tighten the one mounting nut to 8 foot-pounds. Next we can install the turbo hose. Should get pushed on and clipped into place. And the turbo control sensor. Then we'll connect the breather hose and sensor. Now we can reattach the wastegate actuator. These are 2 Torx bolts that get tightened to 20 foot-pounds. Now we need to connect that rod back to the actuator. Gonna put that rod in place, and we need to carefully feed that cotter key through. Either use a pair of pliers or flat blade screwdriver to bend that tab over. And then plug in the electrical connector for the actuator. Connect the breather hose across the front of the engine. And now we can go ahead and connect the coolant hoses. It's best to use a little bit of lubricant on the end of those hoses. They have an O-ring inside of them that slips over onto the radiator. Clip that into place and then clip that back onto the engine. Now we can install the air intake housing, the lower portion with the filter, and that upper section gets pressed on to the rubber grommets. And then tighten that clamp at the throttle body. Connect the mass airflow sensor. We'll reattach that hose across the front. Go ahead and clip that air box back together. Now we'll need to add some coolant. You want to open the bleeder valve that's in the hose. This is just a plastic screw. Loosen that up with a flat blade screwdriver and then add coolant until you see some flowing out of that valve. Go ahead and shut that bleeder valve. And then open the additional bleeder valve. And again, wait for coolant to flow out there. And go ahead and shut it. Careful not to over tighten these as they are just plastic. Now we'll want to go ahead and get that electric water pump working. That will help to bleed air out of the cooling system. You can turn on the ignition, but do not start the car. Turn the fan to low and then hold the gas pedal for 10 seconds. And you'll want to have a battery charger on while you do this. And the system will actually cycle that coolant pump and bleed the air out. Once that's done, you can put the expansion tank cap back on. Check the oil level. Make sure everything's working. You want to go ahead and clear any engine codes that were in the computer. Check for leaks, and you can go ahead and install that lower skid plate. Those go to 18 foot-pounds. And then also install the 2 splash shields. You want to get all these started by hand first before tightening them, just to make sure they all line up. And then move on to the front shield. Thanks for hanging in on this one. This is not a repair for the faint of heart. But if you're well prepared and have some experience, you should be able to do this one. Put the engine cover on and take it for a test drive.